The committee will come to order. The Oversight Committee exists to secure two fundamental principles. First, Americans have a right to know that the money Washington takes from them is well spent. And second, Americans deserve an efficient, effective government that works for them. Our duty on the Oversight and Government Reform Committee is to protect these rights. Our solemn responsibility is to hold government accountable to taxpayers for what they know is important for how they decide. And in fact, our job is to work tirelessly in partnership with citizen watchdogs to deliver the facts to the American people and bring genuine reform to the Federal bureaucracy. This is our mission. I now would ask unanimous consent to read into the record statements from two witnesses who will not be available, but family of the victims of the 9/11 attack on Benghazi. Without objection, so ordered. First, a letter from Kate Doherty Quigley. And she says, in a letter to the ranking member and myself, "Thank you for your invitation to participate in the committee's September 19, 2013 hearing concerning the attacks on the U.S. facility on September 11, 2012, during which 4 Americans, including my brother Glenn Doherty, was killed. I am unable to do so, but submit for the committee's consideration the following questions concerning events that led to my brother's death in particular. I ask that because I am unaware of the answers, these questions have been provided. First, my understanding is that it took 8 hours for the rescue team from Tripoli to travel 200 miles to reach their destination in Benghazi, that there were no dedicated transportation assets in place, and that the team received no help getting through barriers like the Benghazi airport and checkpoints in that city. If this is correct, why was it so, given the urgency of the mission, recognizing the difficulty of what ifs, and that's the way it's written, I nevertheless ask, if those conditions had been different, would the outcome have been less tragic? Secondly, Glenn lived his life to the fullest and took pride in teaching others how to be their best. Glenn died serving with men he respected, protecting the freedoms we enjoy as Americans, and doing something he loved. He is an American hero to those who did not know him, but for those of us who did know him, he is a best friend who leaves behind a giant hole in our hearts. My thanks go out to those in Congress and the administration who strive to learn what mistakes were made that night so that U.S. personnel can be better protected in the future. And it's signed Kate Doherty Quigley. Secondly, a letter that is signed from Chris Stevens' family. Chris Stevens died in the service of his country. He died doing what he loved most, working to build bridges of understanding and mutual respect between the people of the United States and the people of the Middle East and North Africa. He was loved by many more Libyans than those who hated him for being an American. A few dozen fanatics penetrated his compound, but more than 30,000 people in Benghazi demonstrated in protest over his death. Chris was successful because he embodied the traits that have always endeared Americans to the world: a commitment to democratic principles and respect for others regardless of race, religion, or culture. Chris regarded and liked each person he met as an individual. He respected their views whether or not he agreed. One of his friends told us a tale that reflects his success on a small scale. Picnicking in Libyan countryside, they met a local family. Chris immediately greeted them and suggested that they be photographed together. the young son of the patriarch of the family, suspiciously and negative toward Americans, refused to participate. So Chris continued chatting with the others. When it was time to leave, the initially suspicious son presented Chris with a bouquet of flowers, saying, "This is because you were so respectful to my father," he said. Chris was not willing to be the kind of diplomat who would strut around in fortified compounds. He amazed and impressed the Libyans by walking the streets with the lightest of escorts, sitting in sidewalk cafes, chatting with passers-by. There was a risk to being accessible. He knew it, and he accepted it. What Chris would never have accepted was the idea that his death would be used for political purposes. There were security shortcomings, no doubt. Both internal and outside investigations have identified and publicly disclosed them. Steps are being taken to prevent their reoccurrence. Chris would not have wanted to be remembered as a victim. Chris knew and accepted that he was working under dangerous circumstances. He did so just as so many of our diplomats and development professionals do every day, because he believed the work was vitally important. He would have wanted the critical work he was doing to build bridges of mutual understanding and respect, the kind of work that made him literally thousands of friends and admirers across the broader Middle East, to continue. So rather than engage in endless recriminations, his family is working to continue building bridges he so successfully began. 1 year ago this week, in response to tremendous outpouring of support from around the world, we launched the J. Christopher Stevens Fund. The mission of the fund is to support activities that build bridges between the people of the United States and those of the broader Middle East. This was the mission to which Chris dedicated his life. We are grateful to each contribution received from friends and family, from the government of Libya, and from people near and far moved by Chris and his story. In the coming weeks and months, we will launch a number of innovative programs and initiatives. The focus of our activity is on young people, both here in America and across the Middle East and North Africa. Chris served in the Peace Corps in Morocco, and his death was felt acutely by the Peace Corps family. Last year, in response to numerous queries from returned Peace Corps volunteers during Peace Corps Week, we encouraged returned volunteers to fan out across America and speak with youth about their experience abroad. We are now working with the Peace Corps to expand their reach into schools and communities across the country. The Center for Middle East Studies at the University of California, Berkeley, where Chris studied as an undergraduate, announced on September 11th the Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens Memorial Fund for Middle East Studies. Endowed by the J. Christopher Stevens Fund, our purpose is to encourage and inspire students in Middle Eastern and North African scholarship. In Piedmont, California, where Chris spent his teen years, the Piedmont Unified School District Board of Education has voted to name the Piedmont High School Library the Ambassador Christopher Stevens Memorial Library. Chris was inspired by Piedmont High School's motto, "Achieve the Honorable." Later this year, together with a coalition of public and private partners, we will launch the J. Christopher Stevens Virtual Exchange Initiative. This initiative will embrace the power of technology to fuel the largest ever-increasing increase in people-to-people exchanges between the United States and the broader Middle East. vastly increasing the number and diversity of youth who have a meaningful cross-cultural experience as part of their formative education, and reaching over 1 million youth by 2020. Later this year, the University of California Hastings College of Law, from which Chris graduated in 1989, will host the Ambassador J. Christopher Stevens Symposium. The event will emphasize law and public policy as used in the practice to advance global understanding and peace principles to which Chris was committed. There have been more awards bestowed and honors given to Chris's memory, than we would ever have thought possible. But as we've said before, we have received letters from thousands of people all over the world who were touched by Chris's example. His openness touched a chord in their hearts. Chris would have wanted to be remembered for that. Thank you, the family of Chris Stevens. And without objection, they'll both be placed in the record. Briefly, in my opening statement, today we want to both do our job as constitutional officers and be very cognizant of the wishes of the family. We will hear on the second panel from additional family members. Like the first, they both want answers to questions, and they want Chris's memory to be one of his diplomacy and his service. They don't want this to be a political football. The committee's primary obligation as the Oversight and Reform Committee is to do oversight leading to meaningful reform. Last week marked the 12th anniversary of the September 11th attacks on the United States. It marked the one-year anniversary of the terrorist attack on the diplomatic facility in Benghazi. The attack cost Americans their lives. Ambassador Christopher Stevens, State Department Information Officer Sean Smith, and 2 American security officers, former U.S. Navy SEAL Tyrone Wood and Glenn Doherty. Today, we honor their memories and their heroic service to our nation. We recognize also the family members of the fallen who are with us today are those who truly experienced that loss firsthand. Last October, Secretary Hillary Clinton convened the Accountability Review Board, or ARB, as required by law to examine the facts and circumstances surrounding the hideous attacks and the report findings and recommendations. The ARB report was delivered to Congress on December 18, 2012. While the ARB made some important findings, it also raised serious additional questions. First, the ARB structure, along with the State Department culture, raises questions about the extent to which it can be independent. Although it is a meaningful document, this committee has not been able to receive the background information, or were their recorded notes sufficient to allow for a true review of the review. As we convene this hearing, the committee down the hall, the Foreign Affairs Committee, has authored significant reforms in the form of legislation. Part of what we will do here today is to continue fueling the discovery process for that purpose. In preparation for today's hearing, the staff has prepared approximately a 100-page report, which is entitled Benghazi Attacks, Investigative Update, Interim Report on the Accountability Review Board. I ask unanimous consent it now be placed in the record. Do you have corresponding? Would you? Okay. It raises important questions on the review board process. Today, our panel includes distinguished former government officials who know firsthand how important this process is and who dedicated their lives to this public service. And we thank you for being here today. Any criticism of the accountability review process or the law passed by Congress in 1986 that created it should be cast on Congress and the process that they were asked to do, and not to the individuals who headed this. I believe that to the extent that the ARB was currently and traditionally used, it has done its job. Our criticism today is, was it the appropriate investigation? Was it complete? Did it have the processes necessary to do a thorough review? Did it have the authority to go beyond the State Department? Was the record such that it could be reviewed and reviewed again, as many tragic and large investigations will? I think we all understand that if the attack 12 years ago on 9/11/2001 had been reviewed through the accountability review process, it would not have been sufficient for the American people. Therefore, our investigation today and the subject of this hearing is to look at what could be done, what was learned through the ARB. And I want to thank Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen personally for their work. They made many reform suggestions. My understanding is all of them have been accepted. My understanding further is acceptance and implementation can be different. In particular, one of the questions that will not be answered today but undoubtedly will be asked is, if 4 individuals were held accountable and in testimony at least 1 was recommended for firing, why is it none lost a day's pay and all are back on the job? That is a question for the current administration and not one for this panel. Additionally, we are joined by Director Sullivan and Todd Kyle. Their review is a second review, and it is broader in nature than Benghazi. And it is important because one thing that America learned from the attacks on 9/11/2012 is that, in fact, the system failed the people who were in that compound in Benghazi. Without a doubt, there are problems within how decisions are made for security of our various diplomatic facilities throughout the world. I look forward particularly in that Director Sullivan has firsthand knowledge of primary protection of an individual such as an ambassador or the President of the United States. But he also understands that compounds and facilities, both pre-planned and ad hoc, such as a hotel that the President might be staying in, have to be taken as they are but made to work. That, for me, says a lot about the nature of our diplomatic facilities throughout the world. Diplomatic compounds that are Inman compliant need not be looked at in any great additional detail. They are, in fact, set back. They are, in fact, fortresses. The only thing that needs to happen in an Inman-compliant facility is for the rules and the procedures to be followed for them to be extremely secure. But the vast majority of consulates, offices, USAID facilities, and the like throughout the world are not Inman-compliant. In fact, our investigation has shown that a great many exceptions occur every day, if you will, waivers to what is supposed to be. Often this comes in the form of defining a facility in a way different than what it actually is. And a multi-country office has a different standard than a consulate or an embassy. But if, in fact, principal officers are there and the risk of attack is high, they must be looked at in that sense. So I, for one, believe that this interim report closes, and I hope it really will, the chapter on the service of Admiral Pickering and, Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen, because I believe their service, although limited to the rules of the ARB, has been honorable, and they have done the best they could under the rules that Congress gave them in 1986. And with that, I am going to ask unanimous consent that my entire opening statement be placed in the record, since I used so much time for the earlier reading. And I yield back, and I recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by recognizing Mrs. Patricia Smith and Mr. Charles Woods, and who are here to testify about their sons who were killed in Benghazi, Sean Smith and Tyrone Woods. Nobody can fully comprehend the anguish they are suffering. I know from my own experience that losing someone so young and so promising is one of the most difficult things we ever experience in life. Sadly, there are now other mothers and fathers, husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, who are also grieving after the shootings this week at the Washington Navy Yard, less than a mile from this very room. Our hearts go out to those families as well. In addition, although Ambassador Stevens' family was not able to attend today, the Daugherty, they sent a written statement, as did Glenn Daugherty's sister. And Mr. Chairman, I'm very, very pleased, and I thank you for not only reading their statements into the record, but making sure that they're part of the record. I look forward to hearing that testimony, and I hope we can learn more about who these very brave individuals were. I want to learn more about their hopes and their dreams and their service to our country. I believe our goal of today's hearing should be to honor them as heroes, because that's exactly what they were. They believed in this nation, and they devoted their lives to protecting it. There are other ways our nation should honor these men. First, we must hunt down those responsible and bring them to justice. Progress on this front may not always be visible to the public, but as our nation demonstrated in the relentless, worldwide, 10-year pursuit of Osama bin Laden, the United States does not forget. We never forget. And I believe I speak for the entire committee when I say that our commitment to this goal is bipartisan and unwavering. Another way to honor their memories is to obtain information about what happened in Benghazi. Chairman Issa issued a report earlier this week that provided some new information, but unfortunately he chose not to work with any Democratic committee members. So today I offer my own report that I would like to provide to the committee and the witnesses. As this report explains, our goal was to provide detailed information in response to some of the specific questions that have been raised relating to the attack. Our report is based on a review of tens of thousands of pages of classified and unclassified documents, 16 transcribed interviews, and 1 deposition. Our report provides new details about the intense and terrifying week last September when events at embassies and consulates around the world put U.S. personnel on hair-trigger alert for days. These included events not only in Benghazi, but also in Khartoum, Sana'a, Karachi, Lahore, and Islamabad, where crowds of thousands marched, set fires, and breached U.S. compounds repeatedly. Mr. Chairman, I ask that our report be made a part of the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. Another critical way we should honor the memories of these heroes is by implementing the recommendations and reforms that were put forth to improve the security of our diplomatic and military forces around the world. This is so important. This is the Committee on Oversight and Government Reform. Reform is so vital, particularly at this moment. I hope we can all agree on a bipartisan basis that we should implement these recommendations as effectively and as efficiently as possible. On this point, Ambassador Pickering explained to the committee during his deposition that because of his own personal and professional bond with Ambassador Stevens, he viewed his service on the Accountability Review Board as, quote, a debt of honor. He said, and I quote, "Chris gave me 2 wonderful years of his life in supporting me in very difficult circumstances." He also said, "I owed him, his family, and the families of the others who died the best possible report we could put together." However, Ambassador Pickering also said he was deeply concerned that although the previous ARBs were, quote, excellent in their recommendations, the follow-through had dwindled away, end of quote. Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot let that happen under our watch. This is our watch. We're in charge now, and we must make we must never let a report like this sit on some shelves, collecting dust, and then 10, 12 years from now, we're going through the same process again. As I've said many times, we're better than that. I'd like to make one final point, and let me go back to Admiral Mullen. I want to thank both of you for your service. The Chairman said this is not any kind of attack on you all. It's concerned about the breadth of the report and things like that. But I know that you gave a phenomenal amount of your time, and I want to thank both of you. But I don't want to just thank you for today. I wanted to thank you for what you've done for your entire lives. For your entire lives. Giving your blood, your sweat, your tears to make life better for us so that we could sit here and do what we do. And I appreciate that. And Admiral Pickering, Ambassador Pickering, in my 30-some years of practicing law, I have never heard such compelling testimony. I just so happened to sit in your deposition. And when you told us why you did this and why it was so important that it be excellently done and completely done. And I will never forget the things you said. And I really thank you for that. There have been some extremely serious accusations that the ARB was a, quote, whitewash, unquote, and a, quote, cover-up, unquote. Some said, quote, it doesn't answer any real questions, unquote. And that is, quote, the sole function was to insulate Hillary Clinton, unquote. When I hear those kinds of statements, and then I read the depositions and I listen to you, Ambassador Pickering, you know, I got to tell you, those kinds of statements upset me because I think that they are so unfair, and we're better than that. So let me respond as directly as I can. Based on all of the evidence obtained by this committee, this Benghazi review was one of the most comprehensive ARB reviews ever conducted. I've seen no evidence, none whatsoever, to support these reckless accusations. To the contrary, witness after witness told the committee that the ARB's report was, quote, penetrating, specific, critical, very tough, and, quote, the opposite of a whitewash. Finally, one reason I requested today's hearing 4 months ago was to give Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen an opportunity to respond directly to these unsubstantiated accusations. I'm glad they are finally being given that opportunity. Our nation owes them and the other board members profound thanks for their dedication and for their service. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. All members will have 7 days to submit opening statements for the records, and we will now recognize our first panel. As previously noted, Ambassador Thomas R. Pickering served as Chairman of the U.S. Department of State's Accountability Review Board from Benghazi. Ambassador Pickering has had a long and distinguished career as a diplomat. He has served in an unprecedented number of ambassadorships: Jordan, Nigeria, El Salvador, Israel, India, Russia, and the United Nations. Not to be any less distinguished, Admiral Michael G. Mullen, U.S. Navy, retired, served as the Vice Chairman of the ARB. Admiral Mullen is a retired 4-star Navy admiral who served 2 terms as the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the highest rank of any officer in the armed forces. Mr. Mark Sullivan served as Chairman of the Independent Panel on Best Practices and is the former Director of the United States Secret Service, a role in which he and I worked together on a number of tough issues, and I respect your participation here today. The Honorable Todd M. Kyle served as a member of the Independent Panel on Best Practices and is the former Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection at the United States Department of Homeland Security. Welcome all. Pursuant to our rules, would you please rise, raise your right hand to take the oath. Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you will give today will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Please be seated. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. As I said before this hearing in our private meetings, this is an important hearing and one in which each of your testimonies are extremely important. Your entire written statements will be placed in the record. Use as close to 5 minutes as you can for your opening. I'm not going to have a heavy gavel if you have additional words you have to say, but I would like to allow as much time for questions as possible. Ambassador.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and Ranking Minority Member Mr. Cummings, thank you very much. It's an important opportunity to appear to you today, before you today, for this important matter. It's been a special honor for me to work with Admiral Mullen and indeed the other members of the Accountability Review Board on this very pressing, important, and significant issue. If I may, and I don't want to extend beyond the limits of my brief with you, Mr. Chairman, I would hope that our report will also appear in the record in an appropriate fashion.
The entire report will be placed in the record. Thank you,
sir. The loss of 4 brave individuals is devastating to our country, and most especially to their families. We sympathize with them, with Mrs. Smith and Mr. Woods and all of them in their loss. The Board met pursuant to a statute. The questions the Board was to respond to under the statute are the extent to which the incident was security related, whether the security systems and security procedures were adequate, whether the security systems and security procedures were properly implemented, the impact of intelligence and information availability, such other facts and circumstances which may be relevant to the appropriate security management of U.S. missions abroad, and finally, with regard to personnel, whenever the Board finds reasonable cause to believe that an individual has breached the duty of that individual, the Board should report that finding to appropriate Federal agency or instrumentality. The Board met almost continuously for 2.5 months. The group worked collegially and intensively, and after extensive activities outlined in my testimony, reached unanimous conclusions which are reflected in the report. The Board conducted about 100 interviews, beginning with key personnel who were on the ground during the events in Benghazi. It further reviewed many thousands of pages of documents and viewed hours of video. It was provided with the fullest cooperation by the Department of State and all elements of the U.S. government. The key findings of the Board include the following. The attacks were security related, involving the use of armed force against U.S. personnel at 2 facilities. Responsibility for the loss of life and other damage rests completely with the terrorists who carried out the attacks. Systemic failures and leadership and management deficiencies at senior levels within 2 bureaus of the Department of State resulted in a security posture at the special mission in Benghazi that was inadequate for the mission and grossly inadequate to deal with the attacks. Notwithstanding the proper implementation of security systems and procedures and the remarkable heroism shown by American personnel, those systems and the Libyan response fell short in the face of the attacks, which began with the penetration of the mission by dozens of armed attackers. The Board found that U.S. intelligence provided no immediate, specific tactical warning of the attack. Known gaps existed in the U.S. intelligence community's understanding of the extremist militias in Libya and the potential threat that they posed to U.S. interests, although some threats were known to exist. The Board found that certain senior officers within 2 bureaus of the State Department demonstrated a lack of proactive leadership and management ability in their responses to security concerns posed by the Benghazi special mission attack, given the deteriorating threat environment and the lack of reliable host country, Libyan, protection. The Board did not find reasonable cause to determine that any individual U.S. government employee breached his or her duty. Recommendations. The Department of State should urgently review the balance between risk and presence. We did not agree that no presence was an appropriate answer in most cases. The basis for review should include a defined, attainable, priority mission, clear-eyed assessment of the risks and costs, commitment of sufficient resources to mitigate risks, and constant attention to changes in the situation, including when to leave and perform the mission from a distance. The Department should re-examine the diplomatic security organization and management. The Department should organize a panel of outside independent experts to identify best practices and regularly assist the Diplomatic Security Bureau in evaluating U.S. security in high-risk and high-threat posts. And indeed, I am delighted that Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Kyle are with us, who prepared that report. The Secretary should require an action plan on dealing with the use of fire as a weapon. Recalling the incomplete construction recommendations of the Nairobi Dar es Salaam ARB, the Department should work with the Congress to restore the capital cost sharing program in its full capacity, adjusted for inflation, to about $2.2 billion for fiscal year 2015 in a 10-year program to address outstanding needs in high-risk, high-threat areas. While intelligence capabilities have improved post-2001, there is no certainty of warning information. More attention needs to be given to generally deteriorating threat situations. Key trends need to be identified early to sharpen risk calculations. The Board recognizes that poor performance does not ordinarily constitute a breach of duty that would serve as a basis for disciplinary action, but instead needs to be addressed by the performance management system of the State Department. However, the Board is of the view that findings of unsatisfactory leadership performance by senior officials in the case of Benghazi should be a potential basis for discipline recommendations by future ARBs, and would recommend a revision of Department of State regulations or amendment of the relevant statute to this end. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, it was an honor to be called again for government service on the Benghazi ARB. Many have said that our report would either advocate mere reinforcement of fortress embassies or closing down our presence. No conclusion like that could be farther from the truth. We recognize that perfection in protection is not possible, and that fine and good men and women will still come forward to serve their country and risk their lives on the front lines of danger. We should continue to do all that we can to protect them as they go about such challenging tasks. That was the sole purpose of our report, and it was produced with a deep sense that we had to get it right. Politics, elections, personal controversy, and all other external factors aside. I am aware that no report will ever be perfect, but I am proud of this one, which has been seen by many as clear, cogent, and very hard-hitting, as it should be. New information is always welcome. I feel that this report is still on the mark, free of cover-up and political tilt, and will personally welcome anything new which sheds light on what happened and that helps us to protect American lives and property in the future. Finally, I recognize that we are a government of branches and checks and balances. I have always respected the Congress and the tasks it must assume to make our nation great. I appear today against the backdrop of those beliefs. We will not always agree, but let us always agree that the national interests, the best interests and welfare of the American people, are the criteria against which we serve. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I very much look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Admiral Mullen.
Mr. Chairman and Mr. Cummings, before addressing the subject of this hearing, both my wife, Deborah, who is here with me today, and I want to express our deepest sympathies to the families of those killed in the tragedy earlier this week. As a Navy family ourselves, those lost were our shipmates and family members in the truest sense of the word, and their dedication, service to our country, and sacrifice will never be forgotten. And Chairman Issa and Ranking Member Cummings and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. And I hope my testimony will be helpful to the committee as it investigates the tragic events that occurred in Benghazi, Libya on September 11th and 12th, 2012. Shortly after those events, I was asked by then Secretary of State to serve as the Vice Chair of the Accountability Review Board established to examine the attacks on the Special Mission Compound and Annex in Benghazi. The Board was ably led by Ambassador Thomas Pickering and included 3 other highly qualified, respected members with expertise in various areas relevant to this review. The Board members took our responsibilities very seriously, and we worked diligently to fulfill our obligations to determine the facts and make recommendations as to how best to avoid similar tragedies in the future. From the beginning, the State Department emphasized that it wanted full transparency about what happened in Benghazi and what led to those events. We had unfettered access to State Department personnel and documents. There were no limitations. We received the full cooperation of all witnesses in every State Department office. We interviewed everyone we thought it was necessary to interview. We operated independently, and we were given freedom to pursue the investigation as we deemed necessary. This independence was particularly important to me. I would not have accepted this assignment had I thought that the Board's independence would be compromised in any way. The Board interviewed more than 100 individuals, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, and reviewed hours of video footage. We determined, as stated in the Board's report, quote, that responsibility for the tragic loss of life, injuries, and damage to U.S. facilities and property rests solely and completely with the terrorists who perpetrated the attack, end quote. The Board did find multiple serious State Department shortcomings which exacerbated the impact of the terrorist attack. We also concluded that there was nothing the U.S. military could have done to respond to the attack on the compound or to deter the subsequent attack on the annex. The actions of our military, which moved many assets that night, were fully appropriate and professional. In total, the Board made 29 recommendations, 24 of which were unclassified. I stand by those recommendations. One of the Board's recommendations led to the establishment of the Best Practices Panel, which Mr. Sullivan and Mr. Kyle will detail today. Most of the Board's recommendations were designed to be implemented at State Department facilities worldwide in order to keep diplomatic personnel safe and secure everywhere they serve, especially in areas where they face great personal risk because our nation needs them there. The State Department may implement our recommendations as it sees fit, and I understand that it has accepted and plans to implement them all. The Board's recommendations with respect to the shortcomings of State Department personnel have been given much attention. Because of the courageous and ultimate sacrifices made by Ambassador Stevens, Sean Smith, Glenn Doherty, and Tyrone Woods, the Board meticulously reviewed the conduct of all State Department employees with direct responsibilities for security at the Benghazi Special Mission Compound. We assigned blame at the level where we thought it lay. That is what the ARD statute intended: operational accountability at the level of operational responsibility. The House report originally adopted the ARD statute, admonished that, quote, in the past, determining direct programmatic and personal accountability for serious security failures had been weak. Often, higher senior officials have ultimately accepted responsibility for operational failure in circumstances where they had no direct control, end quote. The ARB statute permits the Board only to make findings and recommendations. Any implementation of those recommendations must be done by the State Department. It is not an adjudicative process or body. As to personnel, the statute speaks only to recommendations that individuals be disciplined. As set forth by Congress in the ARB statute that governed the Board's deliberations, discipline requires a finding that an individual breached his or her duties. The Board came to understand this as a very high legal standard, going well beyond negligence, that requires affirmative misconduct or willful ignorance of responsibilities. Furthermore, discipline is a formal term meaning complete removal or demotion, removal from or demotion within the Federal service. Other forms of significant administrative action, such as removal from a position or reassignment, are not considered formal discipline. The Board has encouraged Congress to consider whether to amend the ARB statute so that unsatisfactory leadership performance by senior officials in relation to the security incident under review should be a potential basis for discipline recommendations by future ARBs. After careful review, the Board found that no individual engaged in misconduct or willfully ignored his or her responsibilities, and thus we did not find reasonable cause to believe that an individual breached his or her duty. However, the Board did find that 2 individuals demonstrated a lack of proactive leadership and management ability that significantly contributed to the precarious security posture of the Benghazi compound. The Board recommended that the Secretary of State remove those 2 individuals from their positions. The Board also concluded that the performance and leadership of 2 other individuals fell short of expectations, but did not recommend any specific personnel action. Following our report, all personnel decisions were made by the State Department. I have the greatest admiration for the service and the sacrifice of Ambassador Stevens, Sean Smith, Glenn Doherty, and Tyrone Woods. They were patriots and heroes in every sense of the word. They died dedicating their lives to our country. I have heartfelt sympathy for the families of these brave men. We should never forget their sacrifice. I believe we should honor them by doing everything in our power to ensure that the lessons learned from Benghazi never have to be learned again. The Board's report was issued in that spirit and with that goal. And I look forward to your question.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Sullivan.
Good morning, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and distinguished members of this committee. Thank you for asking Todd, Kyle, and I to appear here today. The shootings at the Navy Yard, which occurred earlier this week in our nation's capital, reminds us all of the vulnerabilities and diversified threats we face every day, whether in our own backyard or on foreign soil. My thoughts and prayers are with the victims, their families, and loved ones. In an environment where uncertainty permeates, one certainty we share is the necessary collaborative effort that is needed in our country to ensure the safety and security of all American lives. It is also a necessary certainty that we honor and protect the memories of those citizens who have been lost as a result of violent attacks with dignity and respect. As a Federal agent for almost 35 years, my life has been and continues to be dedicated to contributing to improving America's security. From May 2006 through February 2013, I had the honor of serving as Director of the United States Secret Service under both Presidents Bush and Obama. As Director, I learned and understood the importance of having clear lines of authority and an organizational structure concerning security matters. I have also learned that things don't always go as planned. And when they don't, it is vital to implement lessons learned in an effort to prevent them from happening again. Mr. Chairman, I consider it an honor to have served with the panel members Todd Kyle, Richard Manlove, Raymond Mislock, Jr., Timothy Murphy, and staff Erica Licklider and Stephanie Murdoch. Our panel shares a combined experience of almost 170 years of security and law enforcement expertise. The panel's report reflects the independent views of the panel, based upon the members' best professional judgment, experience, and analysis of best practices, informed by interviews, travel, and research. It was a pleasure to serve with the other panel members, and I appreciate their professionalism and hard work. I would also like to acknowledge and thank the hundreds of people interviewed in the course of drafting this report from the U.S. government, private sector, international organizations, and foreign governments. The best practice panel was the result of the Accountability Review Board for Benghazi, which recommended that the Department of State establish a panel of outside independent experts with experience in high-risk, high-threat areas to support the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, identify best practices from other agencies and countries, and evaluate United States security platforms and high-risk, high-threat posts. Our report provides 40 recommendations in 12 different areas. In the panel's opinion, these recommendations, if adopted and implemented, will further strengthen the Department's ability to protect its personnel and work more safely on a global platform to achieve American foreign policy goals and objectives. The 12 areas of recommendations are organization and management, accountability, risk management, program criticality and acceptable risk, planning and logistics, lessons learned, training and human resources, intelligence, threat analysis, and security assessments, programs, resources, and technology, host nations and guard forces capability enhancement, regular evaluation, and change management, leadership, communications, and training. The Best Practices panel looked across a wide spectrum of private, government, and non-governmental organizations to identify effective measures to enhance the Department's ability to ensure a safe and secure environment for employees and programs. Not surprisingly, the panel found that many institutions, including governments, refer to diplomatic security as the gold standard for security and seek to model their services after diplomatic security. Nevertheless, any organization must continuously evolve and improve to adjust with a fluid and dynamic environment. The panel's view was that its recommendations should be realistic, achievable, and measurable. The findings and the recommendations of the ARB, as well as the recommendations of other Department of State reports and management studies, were reviewed in the context of the panel's own independent assessment and observations of the Department's security-related operations. Best practices were then identified to address shortcomings and provide mechanisms for further consideration by the Department. Among one of the most important of the recommendations is the creation of an Undersecretary for Diplomatic Security. It should be noted that this structural recommendation is not new and was suggested in an early report 14 years ago following the East Africa Embassy bombings. The way forward should be characterized by cooperative efforts that can provide a framework which will enhance the Department's ability to protect Americans. To be effective, we must be innovative so that we ensure institutions adapt and evolve to meet changing security requirements and needs. Finally, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Department of State, in particular overseas post that hosted panel visits in the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, for the outstanding support provided to the panel during our endeavor. Thank you for your time, Chairman, Ranking Member, and we look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you. Mr. Kyle, I understand you do not have an opening statement. Would you like to say a few words? The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Issa, Ranking Member Cummings, and distinguished members of the committee for inviting Director Sullivan and I to testify today about our independent panel report on best practices in the aftermath of the tragic events that occurred in Benghazi, Libya. Our panel was committed to identifying best practices from throughout the U.S. government, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and foreign governments, which can improve the security of U.S. diplomatic facilities abroad and enhance the safety of Department of State and Foreign Affairs agencies' personnel, not only in high-risk areas, but globally. We identified 40 recommendations to achieve this goal. Importantly, the panel affirmed what we already knew based on our professional experience, that the men and women of the State Department's Diplomatic Security Service are truly dedicated public servants and amongst the best in service to our great nation. Every day around the world, they face extreme challenges, unpredictable risks, and unknown events, but still provide a safe and secure environment for the conduct of U.S. foreign policy, and they do so with distinction. As we stated repeatedly throughout our report, best practices will not save lives unless they are resourced, implemented, and followed, not just accepted. As Director Sullivan stated, almost 14 years ago, a number of very similar recommendations were made after systematic failures were recognized as a result of the East African embassy bombings. And little has been accomplished by the Department of State since then to improve its approach to security, even after approval by then Secretary of State Albright to elevate the Bureau of Diplomatic Security and make other enhancements. Now is the time for the Department of State, with the support of Congress, to finally institutionalize some real, meaningful, and progressive change. The Department of State owes it to those people who have given their lives in service to our country and to those employees who continue to serve our country in some very dangerous locations around the world. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I'll now recognize myself, and I'll go in reverse order. Mr. Kyle, at the current time, isn't it true that both the facilities sufficiency and the sufficiency of diplomatic security rise to Undersecretary Kennedy? Effectively, he is the Undersecretary for Diplomatic Security at this time under the current structure. Isn't that true?
Sir, as we traveled around the world as part of our panel research and
No, Mr. Kyle, please. I have a very short time. You first start by saying yes or no.
Yes.
Okay. So he is, in fact, in a position where the pyramid rises to him. Your recommendation, and the recommendation 14 years ago, is that he be relieved of diplomatic security and that be placed in a separate undersecretary position. Is that correct?
Correct.
Wouldn't that create, by definition, a situation in which somebody would be responsible for the hardware, the facilities, including inman compliance, and somebody else would be responsible for the bodies and the support? Have you considered that, and how would we, or the Foreign Affairs Committee, structure that briefly?
Yes, we did consider that, and, sir, currently there's integration between Overseas Buildings Operations and the Bureau of Diplomatic Security. But
they all report to Undersecretary Kennedy.
They all report to Undersecretary Kennedy.
And wasn't the failure in Benghazi both a failure to have the facilities sufficient and a failure to have sufficient physical security in the way of armed personnel? Weren't those both failures that rose to one Undersecretary?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that doesn't mean I disagree with the findings now or 14 years ago, but clearly there was somebody who had both halves of it and both failed. My ranking member told Politico that we should listen carefully to the Ambassador and the Admiral, so I did. And Admiral, I think I heard you correctly, clearly saying that you had limitations in what the ARB mandate was, including that your limitations are you can't really, under the ARB, look at policy deficiencies, and that by definition you were mandated to look at the lowest level of operational failure, not the highest level of policy failure. Is that true?
I think the policy adjustments or policy issues were well within our mandate. What I talked about in my opening statement is the constraint was in the discipline world.
Okay, so finding fault had to go to the lowest level, even though you looked at policy failures.
Finding fault had to go to the appropriate level.
Okay. Well, the decision to extend the facility for another year with limited protection and not meeting Inman or close to Inman standards was a decision made by Undersecretary Kennedy. So did you consider that policy error, the error to be there with insufficient physical and human resources, as a policy decision, or only that someone lower was responsible?
Actually, I think the decision, the memo, I think, to which you're referring,
the August memo,
Mr. Chairman, that Undersecretary Kennedy signed in December of 11 to extend
December of 2011,
was the result of a process inside the State Department, took everybody into consideration, and was approved to extend it. And I think that was pretty clear to everybody. It wasn't the establishment of the Special Mission Compound.
No, we understand that. We actually had testimony that they were under consideration on September 11th of extending it permanently, but the decision to keep them there and the reduction in the assets to protect it occurred and was decided on in December 2011.
The failure, Mr. Chairman, was not in the establishment or that memo. It was in the execution of what was laid out in that memo to include the requisite number of security personnel, which were rarely there over the course of the next year.
Okay. So whoever is responsible for not having enough security personnel is the person who failed.
That's actually where we ended up focusing the investigation, the review.
I think the final point that I want to make sure I get out is you had a mandate under the ARB. You've said essentially that changes in what the mandate are welcome, and you believe, both of you, I understand, believe that some changes to the ARB to make it more able to do more will be necessary. I pretty well heard that what the Foreign Affairs Committee is considering, not the specific legislation, but considering changes, is something both of you welcome, having gone through this process.
I think it's important, and yes, sir, I think for the lessons that we learned, absolutely. I think its independence is critical, as well as the anonymity of those who come to the table to make statements, so that those statements are made in the spirit of where we're trying to go and they don't feel limited.
And when I heard you, you said that both of you said that the administration, the Secretary and so on, made your job easy because you had full access to 100 witnesses and the attempt was to have full transparency.
Correct.
Do you think that Congress should have that same option? In other words, since the State Department has not made one of those witnesses you interviewed first available, meaning people in Benghazi who are fact witnesses, none have been made available. As a matter of fact, even the names have been, to the greatest extent possible, withheld from this committee. Do you believe that's appropriate, or do you believe that we should have access to fact witnesses as we review the process?
Mr. Chairman, I think that's, and I've been in government a long time, that's something that historically, and certainly in this case, has to be worked out between the Congress and the executive branch.
Admiral, if something like the Cole attack occurred again today, and Congress said we wanted to speak to people who were on the deck of that ship today, would you believe that we should have a right to speak to those people in order to understand the facts on the ground that day?
I honestly,
I'm asking from your experience.
I understand that. I don't know,
in a DOD framework.
I don't know what would limit you to do that, quite frankly.
I am in the process of issuing subpoenas because the State Department has not made those people available, has played hide-and-go-seek, and is now hiding behind a thinly veiled statement that there is a criminal investigation. As you know, there was a criminal investigation on the coal at any time that Americans are killed abroad. So the answer, quite frankly, is we are not being given the same access that you had or Mr. Sullivan and his team had, and that's part of the reason that this investigation cannot end until the State Department gives us at least the same access that they gave your board. And with that, I recognize the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you very much.
Wait a second. Just 1 second. I apologize. I do have to make a technical correction, if you don't mind. It has come to our attention that there is a typo on page 25 of the majority staff report that has led to some misunderstanding about what Admiral Mullen told the committee about a conversation with Cheryl Mills. We have made a technical correction in our report to clarify that portion. The report will be correctly identifies Admiral Mullen's testimony as referring to Charlene Lamb's interview. The report includes the full text of Admiral Mullen's testimony, and the testimony speaks for itself. And the full transcript of the interview will be made available on our website immediately, and it should be clear that the typo was unintentional and has been corrected. And I now recognize the ranking member.
First of all, I want to thank the Chairman for addressing the last issue. That fact came out in our memo, by the way, and we made it clear that that was not correct. Admiral Mullen, as the former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, you were the military expert on the ARB. Is that correct?
Correct.
Over and over again during the past year, Republican members of Congress, including several members of this committee, have impugned the integrity of our military forces and their leadership by suggesting that they withheld assistance on the night of the attacks for political reasons. Admiral Mullen, if you look on page 23 of our report, there's an excerpt from your interview with the committee in which you said this, and I will quote it for you. It says, quote, "I personally reviewed, and as the only military member of the ARB, I personally reviewed all the military assets that were in theater and available," end of quote. Admiral Mullen, in your review, did you have access to all military information, data, and people necessary to evaluate the military's response?
I did.
And I understand from your interview transcript that you conducted this examination not once but twice. Is that correct?
The first time, Mr. Cummings, was with all members of the ARB, we went to the Pentagon to review it in detail. And then the second time, I went back by myself when this became an issue that there were certainly questions being raised about. I went back again to verify and validate what I had done before, and I found nothing different, and that the military response, the military did everything they possibly could that night. They just couldn't get there in time.
So just to be clear, you have 40 years of experience in the military and achieved the highest ranks. You had access to all the information and personnel you thought were necessary to investigate the interagency response on the night of the attack, and you personally reviewed everything twice. Do I have that right?
Correct.
You told the committee during your interview, and I quote, "I concluded after a detailed understanding of what had happened that night that from outside Libya that we'd done everything possible that we could." Is that right?
Correct.
Can you explain from your perspective what it means for the military to have done, quote, "everything possible," end of quote? What I'm getting at is, did the military really try everything? And I ask this for the families who want to know that the country their loved ones served did everything they could do for them.
Mr. Cummings, I worked for 2 presidents. The direction you get from a president in a situation like that is do everything you can. It's all the guidance that you need. Secretary Panetta and General Dempsey both testified to the specifics along the lines of in testimony early February, along the lines of what I found when I reviewed this on 2 occasions. It goes to our core when people are in trouble to do everything we possibly can to help them out. And there were many forces that moved that night, including a special operations force in Europe that ended up in a base in southern Europe, a large special operations force from the United States, which moved under direction as soon as they were given orders. A group of Marines that essentially were sent in from Spain into Tripoli the next day. It literally became, this is not something you can just wish to happen instantly. There's a lot of planning, preparation, as rapidly, to do it as rapidly as one can do it. And if I may, there's been great discussion given to fast movers. Could you get a jet over Benghazi because there are jets in Europe? We have our readiness condition on that particular night. There were no planes sitting at the ready. So it's 2 o'clock in the morning. There are no planes on alert. It's 2.5 to 3 hours to fly there. Tanker support is 4 hours away. You need host nation support for where they are to get permission to fly, particularly combat-ready jets out of that country. You've got to go get the bomb racks. You've got to put the munitions together. You've got to plan the mission. There are a tremendous number of details that have to go on. You have to bring the pilots in, pre-brief them, et cetera. It takes hours and hours and hours to do if you are not sitting at the ready when this happened. What has happened since then that I have been briefed on is the Defense Department, the Pentagon, has adjusted readiness of forces in certain parts of the world to respond. We are not big enough in the military to, and Ambassador Pickering will, I'm sure, echo this, we are not big enough in the military to be everywhere around the world to respond to where every embassy is that might be high risk. We have to take risk and figure that out.
So, Admiral, what do you say in response to those members who continue to this day to imply that the military somehow fell down on the job?
They didn't fall down on the job, and I just completely disagree with that view.
Now, Ambassador Pickering, I see you shaking your head. Would you comment? I have about a minute left.
I think the point that has just been made by Admiral Mullen is very important. We have over 270 consulates and embassies around the world in some very isolated and strange places. The responsibility for their primary security rests with the host country. Where that does not exist, as it did in Benghazi, it falls back on us to do it. The report we provided, you and others, provides the recommendations to deal with those particular cases. We are not able to count on the U.S. military, as Admiral Mullen said, always being positioned to come in short notice to deal with those issues, so we must do better on the ground.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Mica for his questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And many Americans have been waiting for this hearing. As I go back to my district, Admiral and Ambassador and others, I can't tell you how many times people have said, don't let Benghazi and what happened there be swept under the table. Unfortunately, and the ranking member mentioned this, that in my district, and the vast majority of Americans feel that your report was a whitewash. He said whitewash or cover-up, but that's what people feel. And they feel their government let them down. They feel that American public servants were lost there. And now the review doesn't really address anything. Nobody's been fired. Nobody's been dismissed. No one's been arrested for the murders. I can't tell you how frustrating this is. Do you understand where the American public is coming from, Admiral Mullen?
Mr. Mica, I understand what you're saying with respect to that.
Would you please put the mic a little closer, Admiral?
Sorry. I understand what you're
but
saying.
I'm just telling you how my people feel. So they want us to get to this. Then you look at who was interviewed, for example. You just got through, Admiral Mullen, saying that we seek direction from the President. You sought direction, and the President had to do this.
Mr. Mikan, that was what the military got from the President.
But the military is the one that could have saved the day, and the Secretary of State, when you don't have and for 14 years now, we haven't had an Undersecretary of Security, which was recommended. So someone was in charge. Mr. Keel said he felt Kennedy or someone was in charge. But again, no one held accountable to this date. That's the way Congress feels and the American people feel. I tend to differ with you. I'm not the greatest military strategist, but Mr. Issa and I were, in January, we were at least at one post. I know of at least 3 other posts we could have launched an attack. The attack started at 9:45. We might not have been able to save the first 2, the ambassador and his colleague, but the SEALs should never have died. It was 9:45. It was a 5:15 to 5:30 when they died. You testified a few minutes, 2.5 to 3 hours. There is no reason that we couldn't launch from at least 3 locations I've visited and been told that we have in place people monitoring the situation, particular and specifically in Africa and North Africa, and if we aren't, shame on us.
What I said was 10 to 20 hours to get
there. That should not be the case, and I was advised as a member of Congress when I visited and sat down at one of those locations that we could launch almost immediately to rescue American personnel or American citizens in danger, so there's something wrong there. Then again, investigating people above. It's all below the lower level, of which nobody, a couple of people temporarily moved, all with pay into other positions. You didn't interview the Secretary of State. She appointed 4 out of the 5 members, is that correct, of the board?
She did.
Yes. And it looks like sort of an inside job of investigation, the Department of State looking at the Department of State. And you had difficulty. Now, again, you testified you didn't have difficulty, Mr. Admiral Mullen, but 2 witnesses interviewed by the committee testified that ARB member Richard Shenick told them that it was a difficult process, that the board was having a tough time obtaining details or context. Another witness stated, I said, Dick, how's ARB going? And Dick said, Ray, it's going slow. We're not getting any details. We're not getting any context.
Well, we got lots of details and lots of
context. Yes, but we are the Congress of the United States, and we aren't getting that. You just heard the chairman, the delay. We can't get access to witnesses. I had somebody come up to me the other day. I don't know if it's true. They say they're conducting lie detector tests of some of these people to see if they've talked to us. This is the stuff that's going on out there that the American people feel that justice is not prevailing in this case. Again, you didn't investigate if, okay, you didn't go to Clinton. How about the Deputy Secretary, William Burns? Was he interviewed?
We talked to both Mr. Burns and Mr. Knighties, both Deputy Secretaries of State. At the time that we got to them, as it was with Secretary Clinton, we had very clear evidence, full and complete to our information, that the authority, the responsibility, the accountability rested with the people we identified.
They're not on the list, unfortunately, of the ARB. Finally, when Secretary Clinton testified, she said, I talked to the President at the end of the day, but I'd been in constant communication with the National Security Advisor. I guess it was Tom Donilon at the time, the staff told me. Did you interview Tom Donilon?
We did not, because we saw no evidence he made any of the decisions that we in the board were asked by the Congress to investigate with respect to the security, and we followed the precepts that Admiral Mullen has just outlined for you, not to go for the people who didn't make the decisions, but to go, following the will of Congress, to the people who made the decisions, and indeed we went to the people who reviewed those decisions.
I thank the gentleman.
Secretary wasn't involved. I must be on another planet. Thank you.
The gentleman's time has expired. We now go to the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Tierney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, thank all of the witnesses, not just for being here today, but for your service in relation to the panels that you recently filed reports with. Look, Admiral, I don't know, I don't pretend, at least as a member here, to know better about what could have been done than somebody who served in the military and as long and distinguished a career as you did. And no matter how many bases I visit, I don't think I'll pretend that I have more knowledge or experience or ability than you do. So I'm going to accept your word that you reviewed not once but twice all of the possibilities that were there and found and came to a conclusion that everything that could be done would be done. I think it's important for the families to know that. We shouldn't be surprised that some people in the public are confused, because there have been misstatements plastered all over the place on TV and not retracted even when they're shown to be absolutely wrong. So there would be some confusion out there on that basis. But the Chairman's staff report that was released earlier this week concluded that the ARB's independence was undermined and that board members had actual and perceived, and I put that in quotes, conflicts of interest. Admiral Mullen and Ambassador Pickering, that's a very serious charge. Challenges the integrity of the unanimous report, but also challenges fundamentally your own integrity. And I want to give you each an opportunity to respond to those allegations. But first, I want to again acknowledge that you both served our nation for decades in some of the most senior positions in your fields. You've served Republican and Democratic presidents alike, and you've won so many awards and promotions, respectively, that if I listed them all here, would eat up the rest of my time. You agreed to volunteer months of your time to serve on this ARB. So, Admiral Mullen and Ambassador Pickering, can each of you explain why you agreed to serve on the board?
As the ranking minority member made clear, and as my testimony and my deposition, which is available to everybody, made clear, I served first because the Secretary of State asked me to take on a tough job, and I'd been doing that for my life, and my sense of service to my country said this is not something that I should turn down anyway, anyhow. Secondly, I made it very clear that Chris Stevens gave me 2 years of help and service as Undersecretary of State, and I had a personal debt of honor to Chris to take this on. Thirdly, I felt very strongly that we needed quickly to know what went wrong and then how to fix it, and that was the function of the ARB, and I believe we carried out to the best of our ability that particular function. Finally, I had no sense anywhere that there was any conflict of interest. I spent 42 years in the State Department. I knew many of the officers concerned. I have to tell you, full, fair, and free, this was not an exercise in any personal sense of debt or obligation to any of those people. And I believe that the comments on the report, that it was hard-hitting, that it called the shots the way it should have, in my view, is the best summation of what we tried to do, free of political influence, free of conflict, and I'm proud of the report, sir.
I was served, first of all, because I was asked to do it, Mr. Tierney. Secondly, we lost 4 great Americans that night. I have, certainly in the last 10 years or so, been with so many of those in uniform as well as those who serve in the State Department around the world in some very, very difficult posts. And I thought I could, certainly with my experience, contribute from the professional standpoint, and particularly from the military perspective, on what happened that night, and wanted to be able to do that. At its core, it's still who I am, which is a servant of this country, and when asked to go do that, it was pretty easy to say yes.
Thank you. You know, the ARB staff comments were made by the Republican staff report. They said, and I quote, "Undersecretary for Management Patrick Kennedy supervises selection of the Benghazi ARB staff. This places staff in a position in which their duties require them to evaluate the performance of supervisors, colleagues, and friends." Close quote. Ambassador Pickering, how do you respond to the notion that the selection of staff created inappropriate conflict of interest?
My understanding of the role of Secretary Kennedy was that he made clear he did not participate. That seemed to have been an error somewhere, and that testimony, I think, is now in the minority report. I think, secondly, my judgment of the staff performance was that I saw no hint of any favoritism or preference. I saw a staff that worked many extra hours, that looked very carefully at all the issues, that did extraordinary research for us, was highly responsible to us. But in every case, Mr. Tierney, we all reviewed the final report many times. We each made contributions, and the unanimous view of this 5-member panel is they took full responsibility and approved every word of that report.
Ambassador, then, the Chairman's report also raises questions about your recommendation of Board Member Catherine Bertini. Do you in any way believe that your recommendations of Catherine Bertini created a conflict of interest, and can you explain who she is and why you recommended her as a board member?
No. I was asked in the course of an early discussion who I thought might usefully serve on the board from outside the State Department. And I gave a list of names to Undersecretary Kennedy, who was accumulating those for Secretary Clinton. Large number of the people that I put on the list were not selected. Catherine Bertini was selected. She had, in my view, an outstanding reputation. She ran the World Food Program, a multi-billion-dollar enterprise of the UN. She was Undersecretary General of the UN for Management. She has a distinguished record as a professor of public policy. And I knew, in fact, that her own political background was on the opposite side to the party in power.
Thank you, sir. Yield back.
When the staff report talked about conflicts, isn't it true that there were no true outsiders? There were no advocates for the families. There were no people whose service outside of government could have caused them to be skeptical. But in fact, each of you, and Ambassador, you said you had no conflict, while at the same time you talked about 42 years in the organization you were overseeing. If we looked at the bank failures of 2007 and brought Jamie Dimon in to head the board, some might say that there was an inherent conflict because of his experience in life. Wouldn't you agree that, in fact, your makeup was a makeup of people like Admiral Mullen, who was responsible for the policy ultimately, just before he left as Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, that had no response to this 9/11 attack, and, of course, you had years of viewing things through an ambassador's eyes?
Mr. Chairman, with greatest respect, this was not, quote, a gotcha investigative panel. The responsibilities were to provide recommendations to see that we do our best never to let this happen again. Would you choose, put it this way, someone with no experience to come in and investigate and carry forward the work? We used to, years ago, elect military officers. We stopped that a long time ago. I suspect that brain surgery was one of the most early professionalized occupations in the world. Why would you choose a panel of people who knew nothing about the responsibilities, nothing about how and in what way they were carried out? The value of this panel was that 3 were from outside and only 2 of us were from inside, hopefully to give precisely the cross-current of controversy, discussion, questioning, and examination that you yourself just expressed the hope that we had. We, sir, had that.
I appreciate that. Yeah, obviously, this was not a gotcha panel because nobody was gotcha'd. Admiral?
I would, with great respect, say we gave 4 names to the Secretary of State that we believed were failing in their senior leadership and management responsibilities.
So it's your testimony today that something should have happened. They should not be on the job, not having lost a day's pay.
We made recommendations that 2 of those people removed from their job.
So people should have been fired that have not been fired.
Fired is a discipline. It is a different set of circumstances. I cannot respond
so accountability
for the Secretary of State and what he or she has.
But wouldn't you agree there was no accountability?
No, there was accountability.
On a point of order?
And we identified it.
Are we going to balance out the time? It's not
to be honest, the gentleman went over. I was trying to make this quick. Mr. Duncan is now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And earlier you commended Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen. I want to commend you and your staff for the very thorough way that you have attempted to get the full story of this Benghazi situation and incident. Let me just say this. Ever since some well-publicized embassy bombings in 1998 and then again after the events of 9/11, the Congress has approved whopping increases, many billions of extra and additional funding for embassy security around the world. Yet the ARB report found that, quote, Embassy Tripoli did not demonstrate strong and sustained advocacy with Washington for increased security for Special Mission Benghazi. I'd like to ask Ambassador Pickering or Admiral Mullen, how did you come to that conclusion? Were there specific documents that led you to that statement, or
yes, Mr. Duncan, it was a combination of documents and the personal interviews with the people who made the recommendations.
All right. Admiral, okay.
No,
also,
I would agree with what Mr. Pickering, what Ambassador Pickering said.
Your report says on page 4 that, quote, systematic failures and leadership and management deficiencies at senior levels within 2 bureaus of the State Department resulted in a special mission security posture that was inadequate for Benghazi and grossly inadequate to deal with the attack. What were the systematic failures and leadership that you're talking about in that statement?
Briefly, sir, a constant churn in personnel, including security personnel, with an average stay time in Benghazi of 40 days or less, and as well differential and uncertain and in sometimes negative attitudes toward security physical improvements of the post are 2 examples.
I would add to that, sir, that the application of resources over time, whether it was from inside the security branch of the State Department or inside the buildings branch, the training of personnel before they went for the right kind of high-threat training, the physical upgrades that had been sought, and that because the rotations were occurring so quickly, the continuity of achieving those physical upgrades, the stovepipes that no leader, and we've focused on the key leaders in our report, saw fit to cross to make things happen from a leadership perspective. So there was an active interventionist kind of leadership, and we particularly focused on the people with the knowledge in security who actually were making the decisions. So it was as well as knowledge in the area. So that would be the NEA Bureau as well.
Well, you said the knowledge that was available, and several people in the Chairman just talked about how that no one has been held accountable in the way that most American people would consider accountability in this situation. And Admiral Mullen, in your interview with the committee, you were asked about a man named Ray Maxwell, and you said nobody had the picture like he did.
Ray Maxwell was in a position in the NEA Bureau where his whole portfolio were these 4 countries in the Maghreb, including Libya. As was stated earlier, there was a tremendous amount of instability throughout the Middle East, not just the demonstrations, but clearly the evolution of what had happened in Egypt and Syria as well. So as you neck down, and you have the Assistant Secretary Jones, who's very focused on the whole region to include those crises, and you come down under her, the individual with, from my perspective, the focus, the knowledge, the portfolio, the day-to-day focus was Mr. Maxwell. And I was, quite frankly, taken back significantly that he had, from my perspective, removed himself from those responsibilities in terms of what was going on in Libya. I was shocked, actually, based on his interview.
I had to slip out briefly to another committee, and maybe you've already answered this, but were you surprised or shocked that he or any of these other 3 people, the top 4 that have been removed, that no one was fired?
We've talked about the constraints of the law, and those are very real constraints. And if I could, oftentimes this gets equated, and you brought up the coal. So this gets equated to the military. So when we have a military commander that fails, we quote unquote fire them. What that really is, in essence, is we move him or her out of that job. They are not dismissed from the Federal Service unless you get into the criminal, unless they go through the criminal proceedings, and they are dismissed as a result of a court-martial. So there is this mismatch of the perception of you fire people in the military all the time. What you really do is you move them out of a job. They still are in the Federal service.
So you don't fire them in the way they would be fired in the private sector.
Where they are no longer part of the organization. Right. No,
sir.
Right.
Thank you.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
But isn't it true in the military you'd get an adverse OER, you'd never be promoted again in all likelihood, and your career would be over, and on an up or out basis you have a limited time before you're going to be forced out, and if you're a second, first lieutenant, you're going to be forced out before you're eligible for retirement. So in the military, isn't there a level of ultimate accountability in which your career is over and you know it at that moment?
Absolutely, and I'd let Ambassador Pickering speak to how that works in the State or in the Foreign Service.
I think there's an exact parallel. Exact parallel. If you're removed from a job, particularly under the circumstances that have to do with something like Benghazi, your future career is, in my view, finished.
Thank you. Mr. Lynch.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the Ranking Member. I want to thank the panelists for helping us with our work. To begin, I want to offer my prayers and condolences to the Stevens family, the Smith family, the Woods and Doherty families for their loss. I think we can only hope that their grief and the burden that they now carry might be lightened a little bit by knowing that it is shared by so many across this nation, and perhaps by knowing the high regard with which our government holds the breadth of their family's service and the depth of their sacrifice. Also, as has been mentioned, I think it's important that we remember these four individuals were among our nation's very best, who accepted great personal risk to do a very dangerous job. And in that sense, I think it somehow diminishes their memory to think of them as victims. Far from it. These four men, I think it is better to honor them and their memories by recalling that they were very dedicated patriots. They are American heroes. They trained long and hard, and they prepared long and hard, and with extreme bravery, they went out. They went out to meet the challenges that they faced, and they loved doing so on behalf of this country. Now, Admiral Mullen, in your interview with the committee, you said that during an unfolding crisis like this, the President is likely to tell their military leaders to, quote, do everything possible to respond, and this is basically the direction they need to start moving assets forward and formulating a response. Is that basically your testimony?
That's my experience with two presidents.
Okay. Terrific. Did it happen in this case?
Yes.
Did you find that the Defense Department, the State Department, and the intelligence community engaged quickly after the President gave them the green light?
As rapidly as they possibly could.
Okay. Ambassador Pickering, the committee had the opportunity to interview, our committee had the opportunity to interview Jake Sullivan, the former Director of Policy Planning at the State Department. And he told us, this is a rather lengthy quote, but he told us that Secretary Clinton and other senior officials were heavily engaged on the night of the attacks. And let me read you what he said exactly, and this is a quote. Secretary Clinton was receiving reports of what was happening, and she made a series of phone calls as a result of that and gave direction to Pat Kennedy, to Diplomatic Security, to Beth Jones, to do everything possible with respect to our own resources and with respect to Libyan resources to try to respond to this situation. She was deeply engaged. She not only was receiving regular reports and updates, but she was proactively reaching out. She spoke with Director Petraeus. She spoke with the National Security Advisor on more than one occasion. She participated in the secure video teleconference system, and she made other phone calls that night. And from the time she first learned of it, Secretary Clinton this was the only thing that she was focused on. So, Ambassador Pickering, Mr. Sullivan's statements consistent with what you found regarding interagency response?
Yes, they're consistent with what we heard principally from Mrs. Jones and from Undersecretary Kennedy from their perspectives, and what we heard and what the committee heard and what the public heard from Gregory Hicks, who was in charge at Tripoli after the death of Ambassador Stevens.
Very good. And were State Department officials immediately engaged as the attacks unfolded?
They were, sir, in multiple ways and through multiple channels.
In your opinion, did they do everything that they could that night?
I believe they did.
Okay. My time is going short, but Admiral Mullen and Ambassador Pickering, I have followed both your careers. Your reputation is impeccable, and your service to this country has been in the highest standards of State Department and Defense Department. And I just want to say, I think at times you have been treated unfairly, and that your body of work and diligence has not been appreciated by some. And I just think that you are owed a debt of gratitude for your years of public service, number one, and also your diligence and your energy and honesty and integrity during this whole process. And I just want to thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. Now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Admiral Mullen, in your testimony, your written testimony today, fourth paragraph, you say, "We operated independently and were given freedom to pursue the investigation as we deemed necessary." In your interview with the committee staff, transcribed interview, the committee asked you, the ARB is supposed to be set up as an independent review board. Did you have any questions about the independence of the board? Your response, from my perspective, the most important descriptive characteristic of it was that it would be independent. Is that all accurate?
Correct.
Okay. In that same interview with committee staff, you were asked, did you update the State Department in the course of the ARB? You replied, quote, "Shortly after we interviewed Ms. Lamb, Charlene Lamb, I initiated a call to Ms. Mills to give her a heads up because at this point, Ms. Lamb was on the list to come over here to testify." Now, is the over here to testify, is that in reference to when Ms. Lamb testified in front of this committee?
In October.
In October?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And this Ms. Mills you refer to here, is this the same Ms. Mills who is Cheryl Mills, Chief of Staff and Counselor to the Secretary of State?
It is.
All right. And this is the same Ms. Mills that Greg Hicks testified when he was in front of the committee last spring, that when she calls, you take her call. It's a call you don't always want to get, but it's one you always take. That's the same Cheryl Mills we're talking about?
Except that that's what you say he's...
Later in that same response to the committee's question about you updating the State Department in the course of the ARB, you said this: "So essentially, I gave Ms. Mills, Cheryl Mills, Chief of Staff, Counselor to the Secretary of State, a heads up. I thought that her appearance, Charlene Lamb, could be a very difficult appearance for the State Department."
Correct.
Now, here's what I'm wondering. My guess is a lot of people are wondering. If this is so independent, why are you giving the State Department a heads up about a witness coming in front of this committee?
We had just completed, within a day or two of that phone call,
Wait, so you had a phone call with Ms. Mills?
No,
Is that what we're talking
yes.
about?
I mean, I think that's what my statement said.
Okay.
But no, we had just completed the interview with Ms. Lamb, and as someone who...
Well, that raises an important question.
Could I answer your question?
Yes, you can.
So, as someone having run a department and spent many, many times trying as a leader of a department to
let me ask you, my time is winding down fast. Let me ask you this. Let me ask this, Admiral.
Let me answer this, would you please?
Well, let me ask you this, because this is important. The ARB was formed on October 3rd, correct?
Correct.
All right. Charlene Lamb came in front of this committee October 10th.
Correct.
7 days later.
Right.
So why was she one of the first people you interviewed?
She was She was one of the first people interviewed because she was the one in control of diplomatic security decisions.
How did you know she was on the list? Who told you she was testifying in front of Congress?
It was public knowledge that she was.
That's usually not made public until a few days before.
Well, by the time I knew it.
So what day did you interview? What day did you interview Charlene Lamb? Do you know?
Between the 3rd and the 10th.
Okay, and then when did you talk to Cheryl Mills? Right after that?
No, not right after that. I'd say within 24 hours, and specifically to give her a heads up that I didn't think that Charlene Lamb would be a witness at that point in time that would represent the department well. And I had run a department, worked a lot.
Yeah, but again,
worked a lot historically
we've been told
to get the best.
We've been told that the ARB is an independent review. In fact, you said it. You've said it twice. You said it in front of the committee staff. You said it in your statement today.
Correct.
And yet, within a week, Within a week, you're giving the counselor to the Secretary of State a heads up about a witness who you think is not going to be a good witness when it comes in front of the committee investigating. You know what else happened between October 3rd and October 10th? Congressman Chaffetz, sitting in the chair, went to Libya. And on that trip, for the first time under what Greg Hicks testified in front of this committee last spring, State Department, Cheryl Mills, sent a staff lawyer on that trip, and Greg Hicks testified first time in all his years in diplomatic service where that lawyer was instructed to be in every single meeting Jason Chaffetz had with Greg Hicks. That also happened. Did you and Cheryl Mills talk about that?
No.
That also happened. And Greg Hicks also testified that when there was a meeting at a classified level that this staff lawyer was not eligible to attend, he got a phone call quickly thereafter from Cheryl Mills saying, why in the world did you let this meeting take place where this lawyer couldn't be in that meeting? And this is the same Cheryl Mills in that same time frame you're given a heads up to, and yet we're supposed to believe this report is independent.
I actually rest very comfortable it is independent.
Let me ask you one last question because my time is out. Did Cheryl Mills, two last questions if I could, Mr. Chairman. Did Cheryl Mills get to see this report before it went public?
We had a draft report when it was wrapped up. We specifically briefed the Secretary of State for a couple of hours, and Ms. Mills was in.
So both Cheryl Mills and Hillary Clinton got to see this report before it went public?
It was submitted. The report was submitted to her. The Secretary of State made a decision.
So before December 18th, they both got to see it. If I could, one last question. Let me just ask this, Admiral Mullen. So if an Inspector General, if you learned that an Inspector General in the course of an investigation informed its agency leadership that a witness scheduled to testify before Congress would reflect poorly on the agency, would you have concerns about an Inspector General doing the same thing you did?
The intent of
no, that's yes or no. If an Inspector General did what you guys did, would you have concerns about that?
The intent of what I did was to give the leadership in the State Department a heads up with respect to Ms.
You gave not only gave him a heads up, you let him see the final product before it went public.
Sorry, the gentleman's time is expired.
And I would ask that our witness, that Mr. Connolly, be given the same amount of time.
Absolutely.
I thank the Chair and I thank the Ranking Member. I welcome the panel. And I do want to say to family members, I have heartache for your loss. I just lost 3 constituents at the Navy Yard last week. I'm old enough to remember Lebanon, where our embassy was bombed not once but twice. I lost a good friend in that embassy bombing in the early 80s. And then, of course, we also lost our Marine amphibious unit. Well over 100 lives were lost. I don't remember, Mr. Pickering, an ARB at that time. Was there an ARB?
No, it was before ARB became a practice, Mr. Connolly.
So we lost our embassy, dozens of deaths. We lost the MAU at the Beirut airport with over 100 deaths of young Marines. I don't remember any investigation. I don't remember any charges. I don't remember the Democrats exploiting Ronald Reagan's management of that incident. We understood it was a national tragedy, and we tried to come together. I say to all 4 of you, I deeply regret the tone of this hearing, but it's typical, unfortunately, of all too many of the so-called investigations into Benghazi, where apparently there's an agenda, and the agenda isn't getting at the truth. It's getting at somebody. In fact, the Chairman used the word gotcha. Seems to be regret that there wasn't enough gotcha. And so we're going to make up for it by getting you and trying to besmirch the reputations, particularly the Chairman and Co-Chairman of this ARB, who are among the finest civil servants in their respective fields to serve this country in their generation. And I just say to you, there are many who see through that and understand that innuendo and smear and insinuation and badgering aren't going to cloud the truth, that a tragedy occurred, and it occurred because terrorists perpetrated terror. And we're trying to find out, as you most certainly tried to find out in the ARB, how can we learn from that tragedy? How can we make sure there aren't more grieving families before us? How can we make sure we're better prepared? And I thank you for the courage you've shown, not only in undertaking that investigation, but in withering the partisanship that has clouded this investigation. Admiral Mullen, speaking of which, in an entirely partisan report leaked to the press, not shared with this side of the committee, which should give you a big fat hint as to what the intent is, you were the subject of an allegation. I'll follow up on the questioning just now, where, quote, Mullen put Cheryl Mills on notice in advance of her interview that the Board's questions could be difficult for the State Department under the title that you gave Ms. Mills an inappropriate heads-up prior to her ARB interview. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to that allegation.
I called, as I tried to say, I called Ms. Mills, having interviewed actually the ARB had interviewed Ms. Lamb very early in the process, prior to the first testimony here on the Hill on, I think, the 10th of October. And I was particularly concerned because I had run a major organization, a couple of them, and I'd always worked to provide the best witnesses to represent the organization on the Hill. It was very early in the process as far as what had happened. There were many unknowns. I was concerned about her level of experience, and I expressed that to Ms. Mills, and that was it.
You don't think that you gave an inappropriate heads-up to Ms. Mills? Did you give an inappropriate heads-up to Charlene Lamb?
No. No, and in fact, with respect to the independence piece, it never had an impact.
Ambassador Pickering, did you want to comment on that?
I would. I think that there are two issues running here. I think Admiral Mullen has clearly explained what he did and why. I think it had nothing to do with the ARB. I do think the Republican text which you cited is an error. It had nothing to do with testimony by Cheryl Mills before the ARB. The third point is that I believed from the beginning of the ARB, since we were to report to the Secretary, that it was my obligation as Chairman from time to time to talk to the Secretary through the Chief of Staff about our progress, about where we were going, about, in fact, the timing of the report, and, in fact, what our expectations were with respect to the timing of conclusion, all of which I believed was in full keeping with our obligation to the Secretary to give the best possible report. There was no direction, there was no feedback, there was no request to do this, that, or the other thing. And that happened every couple of weeks.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I have one more minute, and I want to ask just one more question. Admiral Mullen, one of the things that's seemingly been disproved time and time again, but it keeps on coming up as recently as our hearing on Benghazi yesterday at the Foreign Affairs Committee, and that is the canard that there was an order to stand down, that somebody gave a command that the military was not to respond. Could you put that allegation to rest? Did that, in fact, happen, or did it not?
An order to stand down was never given. This specifically refers to the 4 special operators that were in Tripoli. They had finished, at DCM Hicks's direction, supporting movement of American personnel in Tripoli from the embassy compound into a safer place. Having finished that, as every military person, active or retired, would want to do, they want to go to the fight to try to help. He checked, Lieutenant Colonel Gibson checked up his chain of command, which was the Special Operations Command and AFRICOM, and the direction that he got was to hold in place. He was remissioned then to support the security and the evacuation. And in fact, only in hindsight, had they gone, and we had a very good understanding of what was going on then with respect to the evacuation. Had they actually gotten on an airplane, they would have taken medical capability that was needed out of Tripoli and most likely crossed en route with the first plane that was evacuating Benghazi at the time.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has expired. Yields back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Stevens, Smith, Woods, and Doherty, God bless them. That's what this is all about. Admiral Mullen, I'd like to direct my questions to you. Within the Department of Defense, was there an after-action review or report that was done, and did you read it?
There always is, and I haven't seen it, no.
My understanding, there isn't a report, and for you to come to the conclusions that you did without reviewing such a report, or if there is a review, or is such a review or report, is something the committee wants to further explore. It seems odd and mysterious there is no such report, and that you would not have reviewed that. Did the ARB ever talk to Lieutenant Colonel Stephen Gibson?
We did not.
Did you or anybody in the ARB speak with anybody from the Office of Security Cooperation located at the embassy?
We were in touch with and spoke with, actually interviewed the defense attaché.
But not within the Office of Security Cooperation. What about, who is Colonel George Bristol?
I don't know.
He is the commander of Joint Special Operations Task Force Trans-Sahara, directly responsible for the Office of Security Cooperation, and was not interviewed by the ARB. Did you ever speak with Rear Admiral Richard Landolt, Director of Operations for AFRICOM?
Not directly, no.
And nobody within the ARB did as well?
No, but actually, we were certainly aware of his input, having interviewed, having spoken with the Joint Staff and the Director of Operations on the Joint Staff.
He was the Director of Operations AFRICOM and was not interviewed by the ARB.
That's different from the Joint Staff.
Yes, I understand, and he was not interviewed. The Rear Admiral Brian Losey, do you know who he is?
I do.
He's the Commander, Special Operations Command. At the time of Benghazi attack, did you or the ARB interview him?
We didn't.
Did you speak with Vice Admiral Charles Joe Leidig, Deputy to the Commander for Military Operations there at AFRICOM?
We spoke to actually General Ham, who was his boss.
But all of these people that I named off directly involved in the operations that night, and one of the concerns is you didn't read an after-action report or review. We don't even know if there's one that's been done. All of these people are directly involved. They were not engaged in this. What time did
I effectively, when I went back, particularly the second time, listened to an after-action report with respect to what happened that night.
We all know.
I stand by what they did and what I saw.
We understand that General Ham was in Washington, D.C. He was not at Stuttgart. He was not in Libya. These people were. What time did the Department of Defense ask Libya for permission for flight clearance?
Actually, General Ham was involved throughout. We're able to do that globally.
I understand he was involved, but he was not at Stuttgart. He was not in Libya. The question is, did the Department of Defense ever ask Libya for permission for flight clearance? I believe the answer is no.
Do I get to answer the questions?
Yeah, I'm asking if that's the correct
What kind of flight clearance are you talking about?
So that we could fly our military assets over there. We already had permission to fly. The answer is no, correct?
Correct. Well, I take that back. The assets that came from Germany, specifically, we received permission to put them in to conduct the evacuation.
Let me keep moving. When specifically did the United States military reach out to our NATO partners, given their close proximity? When did that happen?
Actually, I don't think it did.
And that's one of the concerns. The Italians had more than 50 tornadoes less than 35 minutes away from Benghazi. We didn't even ask them. Never even asked line. You presided.
Mr. Chavez.
There's not a question in there, with all due respect, Admiral. Next thing, specifically, when did the United States jets, tankers, whatever you need to do a show of force, when were they called up? When were they put on alert?
They were specifically looked at as to whether or not they could get there in time, and they couldn't. That was the decision that was made.
Here's the problem.
Actually, their readiness status was upgraded.
You said that no planes were at the ready. That was your testimony. In Cairo, Admiral, with all due respect.
At the time of the attack, Mr. Chavez, the readiness status, there were no strip alert aircraft ready to go.
And that's a fundamental problem and challenge that I think we have to look at. In Cairo, hours earlier, the demonstrators had breached a wall, gone over a 12-foot wall. They had torn down the American flag. They put up an al-Qaeda-type flag. It was Libya after the revolution on 9/11. We had been bombed twice prior. The British ambassador had the assassination attempt, and nobody is leaning forward. There's nobody that's ready to go. Were the closest assets truly in truly in Djibouti? Is that where the closest assets were?
Physically in Djibouti? I think it was between Djibouti and other places in Europe.
Europe actually had more assets that were closer than Djibouti,
yes,
correct?
Sir. They were not in a readiness condition to respond.
And that's what we fundamentally do not understand. Did you talk to anybody who did want to move forward? Was there anybody that you came across that did want to engage?
Everybody in the military wanted to move forward. Everybody in the military wanted to do as much as they can. There were plenty of assets moving. It became a physics problem, and it's a time and distance problem. Certainly that is who we are, to try to help when someone's in harm's way.
And the fundamental problem is they didn't. They didn't get there in time. I'm telling you, if you look at Glenn Doherty, you look at Lieutenant Tyrone Woods, they ran to the sound of the guns. There are other people that wanted to go, like Lieutenant Colonel Gibson. I wish you or the ARB had spoken to them, because it is embarrassment to the United States of America that we could not get those assets there in time to help those people. We didn't even try. We didn't ask for permission. We didn't ask for flight clearances. We didn't even stand up the assets that we had in Europe. Didn't even try.
I just disagree with what you're saying, Mr. Chairman.
You just told me that they did not even get to the ready. They were never asked. You presided as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs when we bombed Libya for months. We did so in connection with our NATO partners, and you never asked those NATO partners to help and engage that night.
I actually commanded NATO forces, and the likelihood that NATO could respond in a situation like that was absolutely zero.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that Ms. Spears be given an extra minute and a half, and so that she can clear up some of what you just said, which we on this side of the aisle consider to be misleading.
Take exception with the last part, but the gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, I am so outraged by the conduct of this committee today. There's 83 years worth of service to this country by these two men, and they're being treated shabbily. And I apologize to you for what I find to be just totally unnecessary. We're trying to get to the facts. We're trying to prevent this from happening again, and badgering you does not achieve that goal. Now, let me also point out that there has been a classified briefing, Mr. Chairman, on the whole issue of whether Lieutenant Colonel Gibson was told to stand down. It was an Armed Services Committee subcommittee meeting. I was there at it. There was a press release that was put out by the subcommittee after that classified briefing, and I want to read to you what was posted. During the attack, Colonel Bristol was traveling in Africa. Unreliable communications prohibited him from participating in the attack response beyond an initial conversation with Lieutenant Colonel Gibson and Rear Admiral Losey. Colonel Bristol confirmed to committee that in his role, he gave Lieutenant Colonel Gibson initial freedom of action to make decisions in response to the unfolding situation in Benghazi. Lieutenant Colonel Gibson previously testified to the committee that, contrary to some reports, he was at no point ordered to stand down, but rather to remain in Tripoli to defend American embassy there in anticipation of possible additional attacks and to assist the survivors as they returned from Benghazi. Colonel Bristol confirmed this account of events. When, I ask, will we ever listen to the facts? This came out of the subcommittee of the Armed Services Committee, chaired by a Republican colleague. These are the facts. Let me move on and ask Admiral Mullen a question as well. Another allegation has been made by many Republicans, including that the military should have sent the F-16s or other fighter planes to fly over Benghazi. I think that was a series of questionings just prior to mine. Mr. Issa stated on national radio, you still have to say, why weren't there aircraft and capability headed toward them at flank speed? And the next time this happens, can we count on this President and the Secretary to actually care about people in harm's way as they are being attacked by al-Qaeda elements? There are some things wrong with this statement.
And I don't know where to start, but how about this? Do you agree the President of the United States and Secretary of State, and I quote, do not care about people in harm's way?
I do not agree with that.
With respect to flying jets over Benghazi, page 32 of our report includes an excerpt from your interview transcript where you explain that these planes would have needed refueling maybe twice en route. Is that correct?
That's correct.
That's basically the same thing General Dempsey, the current chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said in his testimony 4 months earlier before the Senate Armed Services Committee. Is that correct?
That's correct.
After conducting your own independent review of the military assets, did you reach the same conclusion as General Dempsey?
I did.
In fact, on page 31 of our report, we quote from your interview transcript, there's no one I've ever met in military that wouldn't want to get help there instantly. The physics of it, the reality of it, it just wasn't going to happen for 12 to 20 hours. And I validated that in my review when I went to the Pentagon to look at every single asset that was postured in theater, including those jets in Aviano. Is that correct?
Correct.
So, Admiral Mullen, both former Secretary Gates and former Secretary Panetta raised other risk-based concerns about sending aircraft to fly over Benghazi on the nights of the attack. Are you familiar with their concerns, and do you agree with them?
I am familiar with their concerns, and you always have to assess the risks in a situation like that. My own experience is that certainly our military is prepared to go into high-risk environments if they're able to do that. There was an awful lot that night, back to what we've talked about, that precluded that. It wasn't for lack of the desire to do that or help someone in harm's way. The other thing I would talk briefly about is the whole issue of the situation under the circumstances in which Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty actually gave their lives. And in fact, they were killed in a they had just relieved 2 individuals on top of the building. Shortly after that, there were 3 mortar rounds that landed very accurately in a very short period of time in the middle of the night from a place nobody really knew where that mortar fire was coming from. And that's how they lost their lives in the end. So even the likelihood that we could have provided some kind of overflight over a long period of time, the likelihood that that would have somehow sorted out that mortar fire is virtually impossible.
I thank you, gentlemen, for your service and to the families of those who lost their loved ones.
But the gentleman, I believe you have 30 seconds. Gentleman,
yes, I yield.
Mr. Schaffer's asked you about a number of people that you said you didn't interview. Would either of you comment on that? I mean, how did you choose who you interviewed?
I think we both can quickly. I mean, we basically, as we started the interviews, we essentially took the process and those we would interview based on the facts as we uncovered them over time, and I did not feel compelled to interview a chain of command in South Africa. I understand that chain of command. I know what happens. I know Losi. I know where he was, and I know what they were doing that night. Just didn't feel compelled to do that. And I was very comfortable, as I said in my opening statement, we interviewed those that we thought we needed to interview.
I think the gentlewoman's time has expired. We'll now recognize the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walberg, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sullivan, the ARB report discussed stovepiped discussions by the State Department regarding decisions on policy and security. My question to you is what can be done to ensure these security decisions are not stovepiped and that the individuals making the decisions have access to the necessary security information?
Thank you, Congressman. One of the things that we had recommended that I mentioned earlier was to create to elevate the Assistant Secretary for Diplomatic Security to an undersecretary level. As I'm sure you know, overall the Secretary is in charge of security for the Department, and that authority is delegated down to the Assistant Secretary. What we found is that that has led to a little bit of some confusion. When we spoke to people in the embassies, to the ambassadors, to the RSOs, to the Deputy Chief of Mission, it seems like the lines of communication, the lines of authority, accountability are pretty well understood. What we found is at the headquarter level, that was not as well understood. So we believe that by creating this new undersecretary, there'll be clear lines of authority, that the undersecretary, in our view, would be involved in the policy decisions with the undersecretaries, and we believe that that would go a long way towards creating clearer lines of communication.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Kyle, the best practices panel found that it's common across many industries to have a hot wash or after-action debriefing of key participants in a critical event. What's the purpose of a hot wash?
Sir, I think, and as Admiral Mullen said, that typically happens at the Department of Defense also. It's to gain critical information as quickly as possible before memories start to fade.
Does the State Department have a hot wash?
We did not find any process for after-action or hot wash in the State Department.
So there's no lessons learned process at the Department of State?
We did not find a lessons learned process, no.
In your opinion, what should the Department do to create an effective lessons learned process?
I think they need to do a lessons learned process from a tactical and a strategic perspective, a lessons learned process within the Bureau of Diplomatic Security, and a broader enterprise-wide lessons learned process for the Department to gather that critical information as quickly as possible, wrap it back into operations, wrap it back into training.
Any indication that that's being done?
Not that I know of.
Thank you. Admiral Mullen, again, with all due respect, and this is a rhetorical question, you've answered it already. But I just wanted to ask this question to bring the context back again. And that question is, why should we not conclude that a heads-up, as you indicated, is not a desire to coach a witness or an action, especially in the context of an independent panel, such as the ARB?
The only thing I would say is the intent was to get the best possible witness identified for the State Department.
Again, with all due respect, again, an independent panel coaching a witness, I don't think we conclude anything else than that.
Well, I didn't there was no coaching that was ever discussed.
Ambassador Pickering, why did the Board decide not to administer oaths to those testifying before the Board?
Because no ARB had done that in the past, and we had no reason to believe that we would not get truthful testimony.
So this was consistent with the practice of previous ARBs?
Yes, Mr. Walberg.
Why were interviews then not recorded or transcribed?
Interviews were recorded on the basis that the previous ARBs had followed. In addition, it was a pattern that, interestingly enough, the Federal Bureau of Investigation adopted in its reports as well. We felt it was more than sufficient to record the critical and key points that we would have to take into account in preparing our report.
Could you see a benefit in adopting this practice, especially in the context that this panel has found it almost impossible to get full information on making decisions on our own, regardless of what the other side of the dais says?
With deep respect, there is a difference between your access to documents and the question of the type of documents that should be prepared.
What do you mean by that?
I don't believe that transcribed interviews would have created the kind of attitude and approach of give and take which we found with the witnesses, which was particularly useful and relevant. I think that the formal process, in fact, of taking a transcription is in some ways inhibiting of the kind of information we were soliciting, the kind of views we wanted to get, and the broad and open character of the kind of approach we were taking.
Well, I appreciate that, but more importantly, the American public and this panel doesn't feel like we have had access to the information necessary to make good decisions about the movement forward. And we talk about stovepipes, we talk about hot washes, and all of these things that are done at other levels of government, other agencies, other industries. And we here have information lacking to us because there is not information that we can read or bring out to the American public.
Mr. Walberg, I will assure you that this committee will not have chummy discussions that are friendly and cordial in lieu of the kind of interviews that we make available on the record. We'll continue to use our process even if others think that conversations unrecorded are important. And I thank the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman, I appreciate that and understand that you will do that. We needed that from this panel, and the American public deserves it, and especially the families sitting in this room and not deserve that information. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman. We now go to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that the gentleman be given an extra minute and a half.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Cummings. And thank you, Ambassador Pickering and Admiral Mullen, for coming back. Both of you testified at prior proceedings, closed-door deposition, recorded interviews. I had the privilege of helping conduct some of that questioning, and so we've spoken quite a bit at length already. And I thank you for coming back again today on this terribly sad chapter in American history. I'm going to start with you, Ambassador Pickering. In your deposition that you had with the committee, you told us that, to the best of your knowledge, quote, no other ARB was so extensive and far-reaching in its findings of personal responsibility or personal accountability, or made such far-reaching recommendations at such high levels in the State Department, unquote. You also told us that in writing this report, you didn't want to, quote, pull any punches, unquote, and that you felt that you had a serious obligation under the law and from the Secretary to do that, unquote. But you also explained that you were, quote, deeply concerned, unquote, that previous ARBs, quote, had been excellent in their recommendations, but that through the follow-through had dwindled away, unquote, as you said. Ambassador Pickering, it's my understanding that Secretary Clinton immediately adopted all 29 recommendations in the ARB report, and that the State Department is making progress on all of them. Is that true?
Yes, Mr. Cartwright. To the best of my knowledge, I believe they are. There was testimony, I understand, yesterday to that effect as well.
And Ambassador Pickering, I gather you believe that if implemented, your recommendations will make U.S. facilities abroad and the people that serve in them safer.
Yes, we believe that is the case, Mr. Cartwright.
Would you take a few moments and explain to us how the recommendations will make us safer?
They will, in the cases of posts, particularly like Benghazi, stop the personnel churn, which allowed such deficiencies to develop both in continuity and focus and size of personnel. We believe they will provide a better system for the decision-making with respect to the improvement of physical security by the application of higher standards. We believe that the training programs that we recommend will improve the capacity of both security specialists and non-security specialists to know and understand how to, in fact, operate more effectively. We believe that the serious discrepancy between fire safety preparations and security safe havens illustrated in Benghazi will be ended, and that there will be appropriate equipment to deal with fire safety in safe haven areas. Those are just a few, Mr. Cartwright, of what I think are the most salient points. If I could ask permission just to make one brief statement. The Chairman just implied that our interviews and our work was not recorded. The Chairman knows, and I know, that that's not the case.
Thank you, Ambassador. And Admiral Mullen, I want to give you the chance to weigh in on this question as well.
Well, the only thing that I would add to that is, with the immediate establishment inside the NEA Bureau of somebody, of a senior office, of a senior individual with respect to diplomatic security, with the establishment of a separate diplomatic security Deputy Assistant Secretary specifically focused on high-threat posts, And to Chairman Issa, one of the things that I thought was helpful in your report was this focus on expeditionary diplomacy. And if I were going to give you an example of expeditionary diplomacy, it would be in places like Benghazi and, quite frankly, in consulates in Iraq and Afghanistan and places like Pakistan that we all need to focus on to make sure that we do all to balance the need to be there and be there in as secure a way as absolutely possible. So I actually think that the changes that were recommended will have a substantial impact on how the State Department moves forward, how we move forward as a country in these very difficult times. It's changed since the ARB of 1998, 1999. The world has changed. We need to adapt to that, and in many ways we have.
Well, I thank you for that, gentlemen, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman, and just to make the record clear, Ambassador, we will disagree on what a record is. This committee makes an accurate, verbatim record to the greatest extent possible, just as your transcription is being done today, which is different than the impressions in a diplomatic note. And I appreciate the fact that the diplomatic service looks at dip notes, which are impressions of what was said, as a record. And I know it's helpful, but it's a very different standard in investigations. And one of the things that this committee is considering, and Mr. Cartwright, I hope that you appreciate it too, is that the level of record of any investigation done of any incident, no matter what part of government, needs to be considered for how it will be recorded. That's not to disparage you or the history of how they've been done. We appreciate, at least I appreciate, that you recorded as per, if you will, your 40-plus years of history and ARBs. What we are viewing, and Mr. Walberg was viewing, is more how we do it. And I will assure you that if the FBI were investigating the death of 4 people, they would tend very much to want a very accurate record, which is what we're looking for, Ambassador.
They can speak best for themselves, but our impression has been that the type of recording they provided to us in connection with their investigation of 4 dead Americans was very much along the lines that we were preparing for our own use. Admittedly, and reasonable people can differ, investigations and reviews sometimes have a different context and a different purpose.
Thank you, Ambassador. And we now go to the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Langford. Oh, I'm sorry, the gentleman from Oklahoma, Mr. Langford, is there. Mr. Langford.
Thank you, and thank you to all of you. You've done a tremendous amount of work and a tremendous amount of preparation, both for this hearing, but obviously for a lot of the reports and everything that you've done and the hours that you've spent for it. I want you to know we appreciate that very much and what you've taken on the scope of it. My line of questions is just trying to gather a group of facts as we know it at this point, again, to try to zero in on some of the things you're trying to accomplish. What do we need to not have this repeat again in the days ahead? Would you agree we had an over-dependence on Libyan security that night and a security team that was local that was not sufficient for the task, and that we had an over-dependence on them at that point? And anyone can answer that.
Yes.
Would you agree we did not have a sufficient number of our own armed security forces on the ground? We had a larger number before of DOD personnel that were there. They were obviously removed their task as it was done. They normalized, as I've heard several folks say, both Charlene Lamb and Ambassador Kennedy say they wanted to normalize, that we did not have a sufficient number of armed security there that night.
I believe the answer to that is yes, but your implication that, quote, DOD was anywhere around Benghazi at that time is a mistake.
No, I'm talking about prior to that. Were DOD personnel there in August?
DOD personnel served a few short periods in Benghazi, but their assignment was in Tripoli, their work was in Tripoli, and their majority was always in Tripoli.
Did they travel with the ambassador when he went to Benghazi, or would they have traveled with him?
No.
Okay, the testimony that we had received is that they would have assigned some of those folks to travel with the ambassador.
The ambassador took to Benghazi 2 Department of State security agents with him.
Right, because they didn't have other folks that were there to be able to travel. Those 12 individuals had already left.
I think it's really important. This is the SST. I think it's really important to focus on what the SST's mission was.
Right.
And over the period of time, and they were there for many, many months.
Correct.
But over that period of time, the vast majority of their mission was training. They did take a couple forays out to Benghazi. They did make some security recommendations. And from that perspective, they certainly provided some input with respect to security. But my own view is I think it's a reach to think that they would have been there that night.
Well, fair enough. Did we have adequate diplomatic security there that night?
The answer to that I already gave you, no.
Okay, thank you for that. The facility, did it meet the minimum standards, set the Inman standards after the 98, the facility in Benghazi?
No, certainly not. It didn't meet any of the standards that were set for Department of State posts.
Do you know how many posts that we had worldwide at that time? Obviously, that's changed dramatically as it should. How many posts that we had worldwide at that time that didn't meet that minimum standard?
I'm only guessing, but somewhere between a third and up.
A third of our posts did not meet the standards at that time?
Yes.
So 260 or so posts worldwide, you're saying a third of those didn't meet that standard that was set in 1999?
That's my best understanding.
Is there a certain...
Could I just say, Mr. Langford?
Sure.
One of our principal recommendations was that the Inman building program recommended in the Nairobi Dar es Salaam ARB 10 years before had dwindled away, and that it needed to go back to 10 a year at a cost beginning in 2015 of $2.2 billion a year. And that's in recognition that probably among those that don't meet standards, there are urgent, high-threat, high-risk posts perhaps that ought to get priority in that program.
What about the high-risk posts? How many posts would you consider were at high risk, high threat at that time?
At the time of Benghazi, the Department of State with the Department of Defense had an emergency review of 19 posts, including visits to them, which I believe was their judgment about what was high risk, high threat at that time.
Is there any special chain of authority to have actual personnel there, or any differences in high risk, high threat? Who makes the decision putting personnel there and what the security is there?
Yes, there is, and the decisions were made at the place that we identified. The Deputy Assistant Secretary in Diplomatic Security makes the primary decisions, that her bosses are the people who oversee and review that activity.
So that would be Charlene Lamb, Patrick Kennedy. Would that go up to the Secretary of State's office as well to have to sign off on that?
No. And they don't go to the Undersecretary for Management unless there is a dispute, and then they do go to him for resolution.
You had mentioned before as well, that night, or Admiral Mullen actually had, that night there was no one on the ready to be able to respond militarily.
Correct.
Did you discover that there was a contingency plan? Obviously, we're in a high-risk location. Libya is in civil war, or just coming out of that. Did you see that there was a contingency plan for response in case there was an emergency?
I am not aware. I don't think there was one, and I'm not aware if there was.
Was that something that we should recommend in the days ahead?
It goes back to available assets and what are you going to focus on and what the priorities are.
Sure. I would say you take high-risk locations. Yeah, there's a relatively small number that are high-risk locations. Should those locations have a contingency?
Well, 19 is not a small number when you start talking about forces. And so how are you going to make those decisions and distribute your forces? It's a worthy discussion, and I know that the Pentagon and the administration has recalibrated that as a result of Benghazi, but it's not an infinite resource, and so you can't get them everywhere.
And if I could just add, Mr. Langford, the first line of defense is the local government.
Right, which was not sufficient.
The second line of defense is our resources in place.
Right, which
and those are things that we concentrated our attention on. As you know, the Department of State is assigned an additional number of Marines, an additional number of security officers. They've come to you for that support. I hope they get it. I believe that it's going ahead.
Well, that was our concern as well, is that obviously the Libyan militia was not sufficient. We know that clearly now. We didn't have a high enough number of diplomatic security personnel. The facility obviously did not meet the minimum standards. It was listed as a high-risk facility, and we seem to not have a contingency plan. The difficulty is it appears that the individuals that were there were very naked. And we understand our diplomatic personnel around the world always take risks on it, but they seem to be particularly exposed in this particular location.
The only other thing I would add to that, and I mentioned this in my closed statement, is that it was the deterioration of the numbers and the upgrades over time, over the course of that many months, that essentially did not prepare that Benghazi compound from a deterrent standpoint. That it was very significant, and had we had 2 or 3 times the number of people in place that night from a security standpoint, I'm not sure with a terrorist mob like that they could have done much. But what we also lost by watching the numbers deteriorate and not upgrading it, we lost any kind of deterrent capability so that the enemy would think twice about whether they do something like that.
I thank the gentleman. Gentleman's time has expired, and I thank the Admiral for including the portion of this that talks about if you have a strong force, you often don't get attacked, and that may have been ultimately the greatest benefit of additional forces. We now go to the gentleman from Wisconsin for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. Appreciate you being here today. As one of the newer folks around here, I know when I signed up for this, even though I served in my legislature for about 14 years, I knew it wasn't exactly going to be Mr. Smith goes to Washington, but I also didn't expect Groundhog's Day. And I have to admit, I feel a little bit like I'm watching another copy of Groundhog's Day. We've had, I think, 12 congressional hearings on Benghazi, 3 in this committee that I've been on. There's 3 this week alone in the House. I know that I sat through part of the closed deposition with Ambassador Pickering, and for several hours where we asked some questions. We've gone through extensive conversations about Benghazi, and I think sometimes in the bubble that's Washington, having just come from outside the bubble where real people were before I got elected, I think sometimes it's odd that members, we think that we know more by visiting bases than someone who's been perhaps the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I guess where my questions specifically are kind of following off Mr. Cartwright, what I'm most concerned about is what we're doing to make sure this never happens again, to make sure that we're actually honoring the lives of Sean Smith and Tyrone Woods and Glenn Doherty and Chris Stevens, by making sure that their friends and coworkers and the people who work across the world for us in those 270-plus locations that we talked about don't have to face another Benghazi. What we can do to make sure of that. And I think that's by far the most important thing that we can do. And I know that, Ambassador Pickering, you specifically have said you want to make sure this never happens again. And part of what the reports, both reports, have outlined are a number of recommendations. I think one of the areas perhaps that we've been remiss on as Congress, in my opinion, having come from the outside, spending more time out there than here, is that we don't talk about what Congress has to do. This Congress has been pretty much failing to get much of anything done. But I think when you look at the recommendations that came in your report and most recently in the newest report, there are specific things that Congress should be doing to make sure that we protect our embassies in other locations across the world. And I think we're remiss in doing that. And I think what our job really should be is, rather than poking and poking, hoping we get a gotcha, which I think sometimes happens too often in Congress, let's figure out what we're doing to make sure this never, ever happens again and honor the lives of the people who lost their lives. So if I can ask specifically, Ambassador Pickering, you talked about the fact that the State Department immediately accepted those recommendations and they're in the process of implementing them. How about the recommendations you had for Congress? I think recommendation number 10. Have we moved at all on the recommendations that you've had for Congress to make sure that we're protecting our facilities across the world?
I believe that on a couple of the recommendations that were made of an emergency character after the visit to the 19 posts I spoke about a minute ago with Mr. Langford, there have been moves by Congress. It has not been, put it this way, our brief or our responsibility to do the follow-up to the report. There are a number of our recommendations which have to be translated into legislation or legislative proposals. And on that, we rely on the State Department and the budget process to proceed to you. So I think that, in effect, the Congress in this case is not being asked independently to take initiatives, but hopefully to support the executive branch's recommendations to take our ideas and put them into action.
So by Congress not moving on a budget, kind of living on continuing resolutions as we have for the last 4 years, we really haven't had a chance to address the very recommendations I think that you've made in this report.
And I don't know, sir, whether these will be SUPs, 2014, 2015 proposals or not. That really comes beyond our responsibility, and sure, I would hesitate at this stage to try to give you a thought when I don't know.
No, thank you. Well, and it's my hope, Mr. Chairman, that at some point as we continue, and I know we will continue to talk about what happened in Benghazi, and it's a tragic incident, that we'll really focus on, I think, what Congress can do best, which is what do we make sure, how do we do to make sure that nothing happens like this again? So as much as I know we keep looking backwards, I think there's a reason why the eyes are in the front of our face and not the back of our head, because we actually have to figure what we're doing to make sure that this doesn't happen. Those other 270 facilities, so we honor the lives of the 4 people who lost their lives, and I would hope, and I am hopeful that that's where we'll be moving in the future. So
would the gentleman yield?
Sure, I'll yield.
I'm sorry you weren't there on Codell in January, where we actually saw some of the changes that were made post 9/11 in Morocco, in Algeria, and I'm sorry you didn't get to see the facility in Lebanon, which is, of course, famously not Inman compliant, but has several hundred people who guard it with armed weapons, including heavy machine guns, because there's an awful lot that has to be considered in addition to the question of dollars. But if you're available, along with Ms. Duckworth, I would love to have you go on the next trip to the region, and we could begin looking at what recommendations we could help with.
Yeah, and Mr. Chairman, I think that's a great suggestion. I'd love to do that. I just look at what just happened as we looked at what we might do in Syria, and what was one of the first things that happened is we were contacting people in embassies and countries around it, putting out warnings to make sure. So we know there still is a imminent threat out there in certain regions of the world, but what I don't see us doing is addressing that part of what Congress' responsibility, what can we do about it to make sure it doesn't happen again, rather than continuing to look backwards. And I'm really looking forward to the conversations we have that are forward-looking to make sure that we protect our people who work across the world for us.
And, one of the challenges we do have, you mentioned Syria, the ambassador's residence in Syria is basically right on a street with glass windows, and you look out on people going by, and it hasn't been selected historically for an upgrade for a number of reasons, mostly host nation support. It's one of our challenges, and if you're lucky enough to ever get to Dublin, what you'll discover there is that our embassy is on an intersection of 2 streets where the windows can be broken inadvertently by a rock being popped up from a truck going by. So we do have a lot of facilities around the world, and the complexity of it is important. I think today when we look at a situation in a country that might have been more similar to Afghanistan or Iraq in Benghazi on September 11th, there's a different consideration, and hopefully that's part of what Foreign Affairs will look at in detail. But I look forward to having you on our next trip.
Thank you.
And with that, we go